Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Could you wave if you can hear me? Good. Thank you very much. Yes, good morning and welcome to the first Hexham Debate of 2026. And we're really pleased to start our series with Michael Clarke, who has spoken to us on many occasions and is a member of our family, I would say. And we're delighted that he is here. Can I just do a bit of housekeeping? Um, so the meeting will, Michael will speak for 30 minutes and then we'll have 30 minutes of questions. If you want to ask a question, put up your hand or you can post your question in the chat and then we can ask you to speak your own question. It's really important, please, that you all mute while Michael's speaking. And we're just letting a few more people in. So I would just like to tell you that we've got obviously got the whole series coming up. We've got 6 debates in view. And the next one is a date for your diary, which is the 14th of February. And it's Liam Kavanagh on climate, but we'll post some more details about that soon. If you've received an email from us, there is a request for donations, please. When we were live, we had a retiring collection, and obviously we don't do that anymore because we're on Zoom. But our issue is that we still have some costs. They are reduced costs, but we do have some costs. So if you're able to donate, then we would really appreciate that. So I think that we'll start now. I'd like to once again welcome Michael Clarke. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming. If you look at Michael's CV and I was to read it out, then it would probably take most of the half hour that we've got allocated. So I'd just like to highlight that Michael is a former Deputy Vice Principal and Director of Research Development at King's College London, where he remains a visiting Professor of Defence Studies. He was also the Director General of the Royal United Services Institute between 2007 and 15, and he is now a Distinguished Fellow in Military Services. So, but he's spending a lot of time, as you're probably all aware, briefing government and the military because of the volatile state of the world at the moment. So, over to you, Michael. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure. Thank you to always to speak to Hexham and Hexham Debate. It goes back a long time. And I wanted to mention something about that at the end. Hexham is one of the very few talks I still do because I try not to give many these days for a range of reasons. So let me share my screen and I hope share a screen of my PowerPoint. Is that working, Pete?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the title of this talk I gave it is 5 Dimensions of Global Challenge to Britain and most of the other European states, but global challenge to many other countries as well. And what I'm really getting at here in 5 dimensions is all of them are a way of looking at the world. There are 5 lenses, and what you see through that lens is particular to that particular lens. It's all true, but it's not the whole picture. And they all overlap. And it's a way of trying to cut a very complex world into 5 divisions. I mean, you could have lots of lenses, of course, but 5 seemed a reasonable number, and it leaves an awful lot out. But let's just sort of set forth on a journey in this respect. So, does that one come up? The first slide, lots of maps on it.
Yeah? Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We're aware, of course, of trouble spots everywhere. So in Europe, we have problems, of course, thinking about the Ukrainian war, and in the South China Sea, we worry about Taiwan and the first island chain, the second island chain that the Chinese talk about. There's the ongoing crisis of Gaza and the wider Middle East. And then in the middle of all of that has come Venezuela and the latest crisis in Iran. And I forbore to put Greenland on there, but I could have, but I won't. So all of this is dizzying. I mean, every day there seems to be a new form of international crisis. So what are the things behind these crises? I tried to look at the drivers, the conditions of world politics that are making the world so volatile. And I'm happy to talk about any of these crises in Q&A if you want to, but I thought I'd talk about what I take to be the drivers of them. And the first driver is globalization. It's an easy thing to say. We all talk about globalization. That actually doesn't go back very far, really. It only really started in the mid 1980s. Has everybody got that? Yeah. Okay.
Could you mute yourselves, please? Thank you.
Is that okay?
Sorry,
Can
Michael.
everybody hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
So globalization only really goes back to the mid 1980s. And what has really happened is that there's been a big pushback against globalization. So now we're living through what some people call globalization 2.0. We've had globalization version 1. We're now on to globalization version 2, which is a bit different. Because there's a lot of pushback, political pushback against it, and the states are beginning to push back against it. States, the nation states of the world, particularly the autocratic states, they want certain bits of it, but not other parts of it. And so when we look at globalization, there are these sorts of diagrams all over the place, which just express how much globalization affects everything. So you can read down the left-hand side of the chart or the right-hand side of the chart, and all of those things globalization affects: free trade, culture, capitalism, monopoly power. Or if you go to the right-hand side of the chart, trade and aid, outsourcing, different brands, exploitation, affects all of those sorts of things. And the problem is, once you start talking about it, it's very hard to say anything useful. So what I've done is try to look at the economic impact of globalization on Britain, and it's only on. I'm saying on Britain because it's just closer to home, but there's a lot of material, and I try to encapsulate a lot of points in a very simple pro and con sort of way. So the good impacts of globalization on Britain generally are increased trade. Trade increases tremendously, as it has done since the late 70s, early 80s, and that creates greater choice. With trade, we get choice of things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. That's fairly obvious. International competition lowers prices, although we obviously don't feel, we think we've got a cost of living issue. But historically, prices of goods, price of services, price of transport are historically very, very low compared to the mid 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century. International competition creates, as it were, a world of goods at relatively low prices because the competition is very fierce. You get economies of scale, so efficient production, supply chains. I mean, who would have dreamt in our youth? I mean, most of us are more or less of the same generation, I guess, in this group. I mean, who would have dreamt in our youth that you could go online, whatever that would have meant 40 years ago, and get something delivered the following day? A man in a van comes and delivers it 24 hours later. Who would have thought that? And that's standard practice now. Very, very efficient supply chains. We can get more or less what we want, and by and large, most of us can afford it. And capital and labor mobility. Money moves around very easily, so does labor, personal freedom, and wealth. Again, in our youth, if somebody went to work in Canada or Australia for 3 or 4 years, that was a big decision. You wouldn't expect to see them until they came home. Nowadays, you nip off to Canada for 2 months, come back, do your job in between Ottawa and London, whatever it might be. Capital and labour mobility is astonishing compared even to our earlier lives, let alone a previous generation. But then the downside of all of that is there's a monopoly power in the huge multinationals. You look at them, Elon Musk is now looking at a pay packet for him of $1 trillion, $1,000 billion for him personally, if he achieves the objectives that has been set for Tesla. And that is about 5 times as much as it's going to take to keep Ukraine fighting Russia for the next 4 years. So he personally is worth more than 5 times what it takes for a country to defend itself against an aggressive neighbor. Astonishing. The huge multinationals with monopoly power create structural unemployment because globalization creates global efficiencies. So work goes to where it can be most cheaply performed. Capital moves to where it thinks it's most efficient. Structural unemployment. So There's, you're fighting against a trend when you try to preserve jobs, which by economic standards need to go to where it's cheapest to produce. Big questions there. Thirdly, tax avoidance, government revenue crises. The big companies pay as little tax as they can by moving their capital around, and the ability of governments to tax the big companies is going down and down all the time. And every single government in the world, bar none, every single government is short of tax revenue. So they simply cannot raise enough tax, even though they are very rich countries, to pay for all of the things that their public now expects. So tax avoidance and government revenue crisis is a big problem. And then finally, labour mobility, which is a good thing in general, also creates disruption and cultural pressure. Labour mobility, immigration, both legal and illegal, creates cultural uncertainties. So there's a pushback against this. So globalization is in a second phase now, where some states are getting hold of it. They don't like what they see. It's creating discontent and anger inside some of the big and rich countries, and it's just a factor of globalization. It's in a way, globalization is going to take a different turn to the sort of very optimistic versions of globalization from the late 80s and the 1990s. So that's the first big dimension. You can see the whole world through that dimension. The second dimension is what I would call power and institutions. And again, we've lived through a period, most of our lifetimes, from the end of the Second World War, where institutions were getting, more numerous and bigger. There was a sense in 1945 that we cannot allow the world to slip again into the sort of world wars that we had in 1914 and then again in 1939, and that we must institutionalize world politics. So the United Nations and the economic institutions, the IMF and the World Bank and the regional institutions, not just NATO, but the European Union and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and African institutions in what is now the African Union, but it used to be the Organization of the African Association, and then the Organization of American States, and so on. Institutionalization built up and up and up and up. But in the last 10 years, we've seen a pushback against institutions from raw power, just the power of governments exercising sovereign control. And if you look at history over 200 or 300 years, there's a constant shifting of balance between institutionalization of various sorts, whether it's the church you're talking about, as opposed to governments, or governments and empires that institutionalize trade and economic relations. There's always a shifting balance between raw power and institutionalization. And that balance has been changing over the last 10 years quite dramatically. And if you look at Europe, I love these sort of long historical sweep maps. I won't worry too much about 1207 and 1789, except to observe how much Europe has shifted its shape over history. The one part of Europe that hasn't shifted very much is the British Isles, where you're looking there at the consolidation of the union of Britain and Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and then Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as a separate entity. But look at the difference between 1960 and 2012, and look there at the difference between what from Moscow was their territory, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, all there in one big block. And look at it now. Look how different that seems from Moscow's point of view now. That's why Putin doesn't sleep very well at night in various ways. And the point about that is that all that variable geometry that Europe has always had has been pursued with great institutionalization since 1945, through the EU, through NATO, through all of the other institutions, the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and what was Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. Very tremendous institutionalization. That's all now going and is thinner than it ever was before. And so we're going back towards a complicated power basis of European politics that would not have been foreseen 20 odd years ago. That's sort of an important understanding. And so, of course, we're back to great power rivalries. And there's any amount of literature on the return of great power rivalry. And that book there by John Mearsheimer, the one on the bottom left there, the tragedy of great power politics, has become quite a classic of the genre. But everyone is now writing about the return of the great powers and great power rivalry. And what we're looking at is the return of the big four countries, which I know I've mentioned before in this context, of America, China, India, and Russia. They're all big for different reasons. And Russia is the weakest of those big four, but nevertheless, it behaves like a big four. And the point for us in Europe is that of those big four countries, they set the political weather for everybody else. Relations between them and the relations they have with their immediate areas, the areas on which they have natural influence. That creates the political weather for the smaller states. And the important point about the big four is that three of the big four are revisionist powers. So China and Russia have been revisionist powers since about 2010. And so for the last 15 years, they've been revisionist. They're trying to change the nature of the international system in their favor. The United States is also a revisionist power under the management of President Trump, because he wants to change the rules of the international system, wants to change the way things work, because he doesn't want America to play the role that it used to play. So three of the four are revisionist states trying to change the system, which is the system that has done us so well in the last 80 odd years. And in addition to three of the four being revisionist powers, two of them are rogue states. So Russia and now America are rogue states in the sense that they break the rules, they undermine the system, they play their own game. They pretend to play the system game, but they play their own game as well. China is not as much of a rogue state as Russia, and is not as much of a rogue state as America. And who would have said, 20 years ago that we'd call the United States a rogue state? But it's not just me saying this. A lot of commentators in America are talking about the US as the rogue superpower, the power that can't be trusted, the power that is illegal, the power that is actually breaking more than it is constructing for its own purposes. So the great power movement in world politics is very, very unsettling. It's not the first time in history this sort of thing has happened, but it's certainly the first time in the last 100 or more years that we've faced this sort of great pushback against the order that we've understood. The third dimension is demography, sheer demography. And again, I've used this map before, and some of you may recall it, but it's just a straight map of the world with a circle on it. And that circle covers China, India, and Southeast Asia. And the simple fact is that more people live inside that circle than outside of it. So most of the world's population live inside that circle. And that means that becomes the focus of sheer economic power. That's where the markets are. That's where the dynamism is. And again, I haven't produced a chart on it, but if you look at the age distribution, apart from China, which is getting older, most of that circle reflects young populations. So that actually gives you the sense that all the markets of the future are in Asia, and 90% of the growth in exports that are anticipated in the next 20 years are in Asia, within that circle. 90% is the expectation of growth in that area. And so all the markets are in Asia, and the rest of the world, particularly the developed world, we compete on knowledge. We compete on high tech, on knowledge, on, if you like, AI, on quantum computing, on the use of computer systems and knowledge industries. Whether it's Facebook, TikTok, all the IT-based industries. And so, in a sense, all the markets are in Asia, all the knowledge is in the West, but most of that Western knowledge is in the United States. Now, there is one big caveat to all of this, and that is Africa. And if you look at the demographic trends, we're going over the course of this century, from 1950 to the end of the century, world population is going to top out at about 11 billion, give or take. It may go up or down a little bit, but it won't change very much. And the distribution is fairly clear. It's 5, 4, and 2. There'll be 5 billion people in Asia, 4 billion people in Africa, and 2 billion people everywhere else. And what's interesting about that is how big the African share is about to be. Just look at the years across the bottom, the time scale. So where we are now is just the beginning of the takeoff in African population growth. All through my academic career, Africa was the 10% continent. It was 10% of world population, 10% of world trade, 10% of world investment. This great continent never seemed to be more than 10% of anything. And now we're entering into an era where Africa will rival Asia and will still be growing when Asia is tailing off toward the end of the century. And so the growth of African markets, the growth of African wealth, but also the growth of African competition and the competition from outside as well as inside will be one of the features of the demographic future that we're looking at. And at the moment, that's not very encouraging. That's a map of Africa relevant to the end of 2023, and it's a map of instability in Africa. So the deeper colours towards brown and rust colour and red is instability, and the yellow colours are more stable, and the green is regarded as stability. And you can see that Africa is turning more and more red. And if I can't get a more modern version of that map at the moment, but a 2025 version of that map would turn more red, certainly in northern Nigeria, in Tanzania, and the green in Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho would probably remain. Eswatini, in case you're wondering, is Swaziland. It's in 2018. Swaziland has been Eswatini. But this growth in population will be both good and bad for Africa. It'll be good as a driver of prosperity. It makes it a very attractive series of markets. But you can imagine, without a political framework, without more political stability, then it will also be a driver of great inequality and great instability. So that's a second big dimension. Globalization is the first one. Demographic push and pressure is a second one. The third one is the global economy. And the basic story of the global economy is that we've only just recovered from the crisis of 2008. That 2008 crisis was absolutely fundamental. And we in Britain, we've only just now got back to levels of relative wealth that we had in 2006, 2007. And so it's taken us getting on for 20 years to get over the crisis, to get back to where we were before the 2008 crisis. And the 2008 crisis has had other effects, not least the moral effect. It's taken the guts out of the sort of Western view, which the rest of the world shared, that only the liberal democracies were really prosperous. And until 2008, that was a general belief. You know, if you wanted to be really prosperous, you've got to be a liberal democracy to allow for entrepreneurship and individual freedom and free markets and so on. Well, the prosperity since 2008 has moved towards the autocratic governments, the dictatorships. They're more wealthy than most of the rest of us, or they look as if they're about to be. And that 2008 crisis, and that graph, incidentally, from the Wall Street Journal in one day in 2008, that was a single day's collapse, as it were, which makes it look like 1929 and the Great Collapse. But this is what it looked like in terms of world GDP. So there was world GDP before the crisis in 2007, running at about 4 point something percent. It drops to -2%. It climbs back, and that's the dead cat bounce, incidentally. Everything bounces back a little bit higher than it deserves to be. It's known as the dead cat bounce. If you throw a dead cat hard enough at the floor, it will bounce back. And then it drifts downwards towards something that is more normal. So the ultimate, if you take a line from, say, 2007 to 2013, that's what it did. It went from over 4% to around 2%, and it's struggled to live past that. But there was the big collapse of the market, and that, in market terms, that's pretty big. That's not just an adjustment. That's a pretty big fundamental collapse. And if you look at it in longer terms, just on getting a sense of how important the 2008 crisis was, this goes back to 1880. This is a chart of trade, imports and exports, as a percent of GDP in various around the world. So how much of the world GDP was made up for in trade? And so there you are. During the period of industrialization, it went from 30 towards 40%, gradual increase. There's the period in the middle of 1920s to 1940, protectionism. After the great crash, that's how bad the protectionism is for global trade. Then it comes back after the war with fixed exchange rates back to 1960. That's the recovery from the Second World War. And then the era of liberalization, 1980. The era it was Thatcherism in Britain. It was Reaganomics in the United States. But in general, an era of great liberalization. And there was the big increase in trade. And that tops out in the early 2020s. And the world is much more protectionist. And if that graph is now extended, when the figures come in for 2023, 24, 25, I think that the next section will go down pretty steeply again because protectionism always has that effect. And so you can see there, the 2008 crisis was a big problem. In historical terms, it's taking us in a different direction. And what does that mean in terms of growth? So look on the left, there's the global economy in 22, 23, 24. And there's the global economy running at about, 2.83%. That big figure, the 3.4%, remember, is the bounce back after COVID. So the real figure is closer to 2.5 to 3%. There's the advanced economies bouncing back after COVID in the middle section there in 2022. And their real growth rate is under 2% in reality. That's where we are now. But the emerging market, the developing economies, most of which are not liberal democracies at all, they're hitting 4%. And they can expect to do that. They're twice as wealthy as we are in terms of their development. They're developing twice as fast economically. And again, that you can argue about, how important GDP figures are, but they're a good measure of how economies are moving. So the emergent economies since the 2008 crisis, since the recovery, are moving about twice as fast. I won't worry about that one. I'll go straight on to something else. There's also a scramble at the moment, partly driven by US policy, towards resources. We must have more resources, particularly for our new industries. If we're going to remain competitive in the knowledge business, in our IT, in our high tech, then we have to have new industry. We have to have materials, the famous rare earths. And the point about rare earths, everyone gets very excited about them. They're not very rare, actually. There's plenty of rare earths in the world. What is different is that China, over the last 15 years, is able to process 90% of them. So it's the processing of rare earths into a product like that you can use in car batteries and in mobile phones and so on. That's all done in China or by Chinese companies. And that's something that some of us have been talking about for the last 10 years or so. It seems only to have dawned on the White House this year that the Chinese had a stranglehold over rare earths. And it came as quite a shock, apparently, to the Trump administration, who obviously hadn't been paying attention. But there's no shortage of rare earths. It's the shortage is in processing. And so that processing is now gearing up in the US and in Europe. I mean, nobody now wants to depend on China, but there's no real resource scarcity in the world. The scarcity is in ability to exploit those resources where they are and to process them. And if you identify rare earths that are a bit less rare, there's any number of them. I mean, I won't try and go through that chart, but just give you a sense, is there is no shortage of resource. The earth is extraordinarily resourceful. And interestingly, there's not that many in Greenland, I point out. But there you are. The earth is extraordinarily resourceful. It's all a matter of how we manage it. There's no need to scramble for them, but we are scrambling for them because of imbalances in the way they have been exploited in the past and are being exploited. So that's the fourth big driver, the fourth big dimension. And the last one is political identity and political ideology. That's a chart produced by Freedom House. Freedom House are very good at looking very objectively and independently at the state of democracy around the world. And they produce these charts every year. And this is their chart for 2025, based on material they collected in 2024. And what it reflects is the darker colors are the countries that they regard as fundamentally democratic, and the lighter colors are those which are fundamentally not democratic. And this is a snapshot of the latest one. But if you go onto their website and bring this up, you can run this dynamically for the last 10 or 15 years, and you'll see that in 2010 there's a lot more blue on it, and as the thing runs across the years from 2010 to 2024, it goes lighter and lighter and lighter, and that's where we are now. The fact is, I mean, the simple fact is that the free trading liberal democracies are becoming an endangered species. And I say, how many of there's 200 states in the world, how many of them are genuine free trading liberal democracies? And I think the answer is probably maybe 30 out of 200. And that doesn't include all 27 members of the European Union or all 32 members of NATO, although it does include most of them. But I'd say about 30 countries out of 200 are genuine free trading liberal democracies, and they're not all perfect democracies by any stretch. And what about the United States? Well, is the United States going to be a democracy? I think internally, that is a question for the next 10 years. The battle has been joined, and the US, we're witnessing the beginning of what I suspect will be a decade of as it were, civil war, not real civil war, although who knows, but civil war in a governmental sense over American democracy. And MAGA republicanism will go long after President Trump steps down or finishes one way or another in office in 2028, if not before. And I think MAGA republicanism may well win the White House next time round, or could do. So it might be another 8 years after this. We might be in for this sort of Americanism for the next 12 years or even longer. It's a phenomenon of American history. And whether America is giving up on its own democracy, we don't know, but it's fighting it. But I'm certain, completely and utterly certain, that America has now given up on trying to lead the democracies in the world. The Americans don't want to lead the free trading liberal democracies because they have a different agenda. And that agenda is this. It's Christian nationalism. There's an enormous discussion in America now about Christian nationalism, taking America back for God. And Christian nationalism is a force that sees a need to get back to what they think of as first principles of proper Christian behavior, where men are men and women know their place, where it's essentially based on a kind of I hesitate to use the phrase white supremacy because it's so easily misinterpreted, but it is underneath it all is a white supremacist yearning for the America they thought they had back in the 1930s and 40s before the civil rights movement actually upset the sort of status quo as they saw it then. And Christian nationalism is a very strong element at the moment in American government. And so the Christian nationalists in the American government, they see a lot to like in Russia. They know that Russia is a totalitarian state, but they like the Christian nationalists, in their case, Orthodox Christianity. They like the Orthodox Christianity that they see in Russia. They look at Hungary and they look at they don't really mind that Orban and the Fidesz party are fundamentally anti-democratic. They like the traditional values of Orban. They like the traditional values of the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland. They make common cause with the groups and countries that they think encapsulate Christian nationalism. They are fundamentally hostile to international organizations because they see them as somehow a common denominator that makes everything too woke and stops action and prevents things happening. And they go back into national sovereignty, that states should guard their national sovereignty. And international cooperation is a route down a slippery slope. So you should have strong nation states run by strong Christian nationalists who actually portray those fundamental values, family values, as the Americans see it. Now, question is, how strong is this in the United States? This is a very interesting, I won't try and go through this chart in any detail, of course, but it's the share of religious nationalists, and it varies widely across countries. So the green bits show the proportion of a population who are, as it were, Christian, are religious observers or observe a religion that are take a nationalist point of view. So take the top one as an example, Kenya. So in a country with 85% of the population claiming to be religious, right? So 32 plus 53. So where 85% of the country in total say they are religious and behave in a religiously observant way, 32% are religious nationalists, by which you mean that they want to use their state to promote, in their case, Christianity, right? So they want to use the state to promote the religion globally, right? Not just to promote it by missionary work, but for the state to actually adopt a foreign policy which helps that religion develop. That's what Christian nationalism is about. And of course, they've got religious nationalism lower down the chart for Buddhism, for Hindu, Jewish, Muslim. Now, look halfway down that top part under Christian, halfway down there is the United States. And what that shows is of 64% in total who are religious observers or observe a religion, who feel strongly religious, only 6% you would define as Christian nationalists. That's not very many. 6% out of 64% total. In Britain, of course, it's very low indeed. It's 1% out of a 43% total. It's a bit below that. But that figure for the United States is quite small. And what's interesting about this is that the Christian nationalists, they've got hold of the government. They've got hold of the White House. They've got hold of the Supreme Court. They've got hold of Congress. They've got hold of quite big sections of the media. And they've also got hold of quite a large part of the, if you like, the commanding heights of the economy. Quite a lot of the big capitalist enterprises are going along with this. Whether they believe it or not, I don't know, but they go along with it. And so at the moment, this relatively slim minority of Christian nationalists are in control of American foreign policy. And I'm not over dramatizing that, because this is my final point, really, that I come to the national security strategy of the United States. And here it is. This is the actual document that I play around with. I've got that sort of on no, you won't see that very clearly. But anyway, this is the real document. And the national security strategy of the United States, which came out in November, had a very sort of neutral view of the rest of the world. It said the Americans are not going to make moral judgments about the world. They will accept China, and they were not going to argue about what the Chinese do in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, the genocidal policy of China. They're not going to get too upset about Russia. The Russians have got their own views and so on. They're not going to worry too much about that. And so they've got this very sort of live and let live view of the rest of the world, except when it comes to Europe. And here they are in 2.5 pages, and they let fly. And this is the national security strategy, and I'm quoting from the real document now. It says that Europe is in danger of what they call civilizational erasure, that immigration is changing Europe, and that Europe's policy, it undermines political liberty, sovereignty. Migration policies are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, suppression of political opposition, loss of national identities. And on the following page, they go even further. They say that that those who resist making peace with Russia, those who resist the American view that the Ukrainians ought to just give in and call it peace, they say the people behind that are unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. They say that those governments are subverting the democratic process, they say. And then further down, they say America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote the revival of spirit, and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives us cause for optimism. So these patriotic European parties, by whom they mean the AfD in Germany, Reform in Britain, the Fidesz party in Hungary, they mean all the parties that are at the moment are regarded as beyond the mainstream of Western liberal democracy. Those parties that are trying to break in to that liberal democratic mainstream, and some of them are doing so. Witness Reform in Britain. So the national security strategy itself may or may not be a policy document. I mean, some national security strategies turn out to be really important. Some of them don't turn out to be so important. But what it shows us, what it shows me, is that the group who are in charge in the United States at the moment, and will remain in charge for some time, they don't just oppose European policies, they despise us. We've got to accept that. It's no good trying to get on terms with this view. I mean, it's strictly transactional. If we can do a deal with them, we'll do a deal. But don't pretend that they like us, because this particular group, this group who are in power, they despise us. And Donald Trump, may enjoy his golf course in Scotland, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, might enjoy the chocolate box scenery of the Cotswold villages for his holiday. But the real Britain, the Britain that we inhabit, the day-to-day Britain that we know, they despise us. And I think we just got to live with that. We can get angry about it, we can be annoyed about it, but it doesn't matter. That's the way it is. And so we're going to have to live with that change in our sort of broader environment. The liberal democracies are under pressure, both inside and outside, in a way that I've never known before in my lifetime. And so there we are. Britain, I always think I like this image, a satellite image. There's Britain in Europe. It shows how close we are. And if you go, keep on going eastwards, and there you're into the Russian steppes, the Asian steppes. It shows what a small place Europe actually is. But this is the map of Europe that I think is, in a way, again, another satellite image centered from Warsaw. This is what really bothers us. And, 25 years ago, if I was giving this talk then, I'd have been talking about, how do we characterize the progressive world that is now within our grasp? The year 2000, the turn of the millennium, the Cold War was over. There seemed to be a progressive world out there. And 10 or 15 years ago, if I'd be giving this talk, 2010, we'd have been talking about, well, how can we promote a progressive future? What are we doing wrong that we've not made our future more progressive than it seems to be? And even 5 years ago, in 2021, giving this talk, I'd be talking about, well, how can we manage a really difficult environment, an environment that's getting more difficult all the time? What are we doing wrong? What else do we need to do? But here I am now. And in a way, the argument is much simpler. It is how can we preserve the liberal democracies that we have? How can we hold on to those things which are so important to us in the storm that is breaking all around us? And that's why I think we as a society, have got to decide what's really important to us. And we've got to hold on to it, really hold on to it. And if I just end on a completely personal note, as I said at the beginning, I do very few of these talks, mainly because I don't say what people I think would like to hear. I don't enjoy giving them, actually. And when I'm talking to the military and to the government, I give it to them straight. I tell the military we're heading for war with Russia and we're going to lose it. That gets them upright in their seats. And it doesn't mean to say it's inevitable, but that's the path that we're on. We've got to hold on to what's important. And the reason I'm happy to do Hexham and another one, Kiel World Affairs, is like you, they're a terrific example of civic commitment and interest. And the reason I do it, partly out of friendship and loyalty, but also because groups like you, I used to say groups like you were really encouraging. It was really encouraging that you existed and that were as vigorous as you are. But I now go beyond that. I say it's not just encouraging, it's incredibly important. Because as we try to hold on to what's important to us, and as we try to dig in to the things that really matter and preserve what matters to us as this storm breaks around us, then people like you, groups like yours, are the sort of glue which holds the fabric together. You're the glue. You're so important. And I would not necessarily have said that. I would have said you were very encouraging a few years ago. Now I think you're really, really important. And so well done for that. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Michael. That was a huge sweep, and there's so much to discuss on that. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this debate is that the idea of all the tensions between the individual, our societies or our communities, our governance, our governments, and also the tensions are happening on an international level. So I'd just like to ask you a question, and you're talking about war. So I don't think we would have expected that NATO would be under attack from America and Russia at the same time. And whether we think NATO is a good thing or not, it's what we've got. And I'm wondering what you think the future of NATO will be. Because I think people are really worried about war at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the NATO we've known is collapsing in two dimensions at the moment. It's collapsing in a transatlantic dimension in the sense that, I mean, the Americans might, stick to their commitments under the NATO treaty, but the answer is might, not obviously will. And so it's all conditional. Would the Americans actually fight alongside the European allies? Well, it would depend on the nature of the crisis. As things stand at the moment, the answer is almost certainly no. But in 3 or 4 years' time, under a different crisis, maybe with a different president, even though a MAGA Republican, the answer might be yes. It's conditional. So that transatlantic link is much weaker. And because the transatlantic link is weaker, the whole edifice of NATO is a very impressive defensive alliance. And it is, I promise you, a defensive alliance. I mean, I get this question all the time from East European Russian commentators. NATO's aggressive intent. I say NATO has never had a plan to attack the Warsaw Pact or Russia. Never. The plan doesn't exist. Never has done. NATO has enlarged itself probably more than it was sensible to do, and that's we can argue about that. But it's never had an aggressive military plan against the East. It's always been a defensive alliance. So the transatlantic element is now weaker than it was, but it's also collapsing in a north-south sense because at 32 members, it's too big. It was most impressive. It was at its strongest, both militarily and politically, when it was 15 and then 16. And then when the Cold War came to an end, suddenly everybody wanted to join. And NATO didn't actually want to enlarge itself. It thought it was a bit of a nuisance, but for political reasons, there was a big push to make it bigger because everybody wanted to get under the American umbrella, in effect. And there's a difference now between the northern and the southern agendas. So the North European states, Britain, the Scandinavians, Denmark, Netherlands, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, they have a very clear agenda, and we worry about Russia a lot. The southern states, so the Iberian states, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Southeast Europe. They worry about Mediterranean issues, of course, but they worry about terrorism, about uncontrolled immigration. They have a different agenda. They take a different view of the Russian issue than the North Europeans. And that North-South difference in agenda is getting quite big. And it could have been managed if the transatlantic bit was strong, but it isn't. And so NATO is in a state of collapse now, in effect. Now, it doesn't mean to say that NATO will go out of business, but it will become a bit of a zombie organization. And I suspect that what will happen is that the North Europeans, which is basically 12 or 13 countries, in which Britain might end up playing some sort of lead role, the North Europeans will strengthen up and start to look like the old NATO on as it were, on a smaller set of borders, on a smaller perimeter of political and physical perimeter. The big question there, of course, is what about France? Because France, as you can see from the map there, from the satellite image, France is both a north and a southern state. It's got an Atlantic seaboard and a Mediterranean seaboard. So Germany, we know where Germany stands on most of these things. We know where Poland stands, but what about France? That's a big question for the future. But essentially, yeah, NATO is in manifest crisis in two dimensions, transatlantically and in terms of North-South relations.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Right, we've got some questions in the chat. I'm wondering, Michael, if you could close down your PowerPoint so we can just see everybody who's on the call.
Yeah.
Caroline Westgate, do you want to ask your own question?
Okay, Michael, can you comment?
Hi, Caroline. Yeah.
Hello. Can you comment on the effectiveness of the opposition to Christian nationalism within America itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the moment, the opposition doesn't know what to do. The Democrats are still, as it were, poleaxed by the effect of the loss last November, or November before last, and also the fact that the Trump administration very cleverly, or the Republicans, hit them every week with something else, and it's this sort of momentum that the Democrats, they don't know what to be most angry about first. Every time they get angry about something, if something even more outrageous for them happens, so the Democrats are trying to form some sort of idea of what it is they represent, and they're not clear about that. And secondly, there is some pushback now in the Republican Party because the Christian nationalists, they run deep in the MAGA movement, and the roots of it are absolutely and completely committed to Trump as a person. But those roots go very deep, but they're quite narrow. And the big issue will be what happens in the midterms this November, because if the administration really is pushed back, if they lose the House in Congress, even more if they were to lose the House and the Senate, and there'd be a big pushback on some of the other elections, I think Republicans who are uncomfortable with this but have been quiet, kept their heads down, I think will begin to emerge saying that this is not the way that the Republican Party needs to go. But if the economy is doing quite well by the autumn next year, and if the Trump administration maintains its position and only loses the House but holds on to the Senate and doesn't lose the House too badly, then I think the opposition will stay muted. So there is opposition to it. But it's polarized, and it's polarized over the ICE, the immigration enforcement officials. What's been happening in Minnesota and Portland, Oregon, all of that is making everything worse at the moment in the States. And the opposition, the opposition doesn't know what to do because the administration keeps doubling down on everything. And Trump is saying, if you actually attack any of our people, our ICE people, I'll double and treble the numbers there. And they're recruiting these ICE enforcement officers literally by the tens of thousands, and they are becoming a kind of a presidential stormtrooper group, and that can't go on. But at the moment, the administration will not back off. They won't take a single step backwards on any of the popular discontent that is coming up against them. So it'll depend on something happening in Congress or possibly the Supreme Court, which is not quite as in Trump's pocket as he would have wanted and which he assumed. And the Supreme Court's got 2 or 3 big issues coming up in front of it. See how they go. If they go against Trump, it might actually make people around him. I mean, like J.D. Vance, who's a great, he stiffens Trump's resolve on a lot of things, and Steve Miller, who's the other great sort of sidekick to Trump, who intellectualizes a lot of the instincts that Trump has. If the Supreme Court, goes in favor of the of presidential decisions, particularly over tariffs, then I think J.D. Vance and Steve Miller will say, right, that's it, keep on, keep on. This is the revolution. What they're trying to do is to kill off the Democratic Party for good, to change American politics for a new era, to move it significantly to the right, to a Christian nationalist country that is not bounced between sort of different versions of liberal democracy. That's what they're trying to kill.
That's great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Caroline. Hugh, I think you've got a sort of supplementary question to Caroline's. Would you like to ask that about reform?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Michael. I'm so glad you keep coming to Hexham and Kiel. But what I'm seeing, we're all seeing, I think, is the way that reform is growing here, and on a similar agenda, although it's not called Christian nationalism, it's a similar agenda.
Yeah.
And also, they would like to kill the Tory party as well as the Labour Party. So, how do you see that impact working here? And also, what can we do to counter that? And I just to say, the Rutger Bregman in the Reith lectures was arguing very strongly for the power of strong groups to work against the trend. So he refers back to, for example, abolitionism, the suffragettes, where small groups of people really had an impact.
Yes, absolutely right. And that's why I go back to what I said at the end, that I think, groups like yourselves and Keel and other groups are incredibly important now. They're not just impressive, they're important, because this is the mechanism for mobilizing people's determination to hold on to the society and the liberal democracy and the things that matter to us. And I hope they do still matter to the majority of the population. I think they do. I think there's a sense of powerlessness in the face of political forces which are being driven by different things. And most people think that Nigel Farage is a great opportunist. He's very good at certain things, and that reform is his way of getting to power. It's it's not Brexit anymore. It's not the UK UKIP. It was UKIP, then it was Brexit. Now it's reform. It's different routes for him to be the sort of person he wants to be in British politics. And in terms of countering reform. And I, like many people, I guess, on this group, I've got no time for reform because they've got simplistic answers to complex problems.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that they'd be incompetent, and it would be very difficult for them to really break the mold of British politics, even though that mold is changing. And I think the weaknesses of reform are not exposed very well. I mean, in the sense that Farage has got a lot of answering to do for his career, not just what he did as a young man at Dulwich College, but I mean the way in which he was apologizing for the Russians, all the stuff he did on RT, the Russian television station. I mean, he really apologized for the Russians over the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and he always gets away with it by saying, "Well, I'm only asking the question. I asked the question." And I think that should be put back to him, as well as a lot of financial stuff, as well as a lot of the fact that reform is attracting to it people who are eccentric, people who are very sort of limited in their political outlook. You always get this with new parties. That new parties always look as if they're stuffed with eccentrics. And as somebody said to me, I'm not sure I should be saying this really on a podcast, but somebody said to me, a very good political observer, 2 days ago, I had lunch with him, and he said, if Liz Truss joins Reform now, he'll have the complete asylum. He'll have them all there. I mean, there are ways of there are ways of exposing those weaknesses, but it's not just a matter of exposing Reform's weaknesses. Our mainstream, Kemi Badenoch trying to redesign the Conservative Party. I wish her well. I wish her well. We need a stronger right of centre and left of centre mainstream, which stands for fundamental values where we disagree over tactics between the centre right and the centre left, but we understand the fundamentals, and that's really important. That we we think in terms of mobilising that mainstream. And I don't mind if you're Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives or Keir Starmer's Labour. Don't mind, as long as you're in the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great, that was a good question. Thanks so much. So David Mellor, you've posted a question about soft power in Russia. Would you like to ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Just following up Michael's point about Russia, could Russia be winning the war against the West? Which is quite a very profound comment. Is that going to be military power or the soft power? Um, and the soft power includes political, being able to control or influence political events in the Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound too alarmist when I said I tell the military that we're going to fight a war and we're going to lose it. What I mean by that, and I do spell it out to them when I've started a presentation, is that I think we're heading for a military confrontation with Russia, which may or may not become a more generalized conflict. But I think we're heading for a military confrontation, certainly at sea, maybe on land as well. And when it happens, we're not going to do very well. Not because we don't know what to do, but we just don't have the right material to sustain a campaign, say, in some part of Europe. Say we try to help protect Moldova against the Russian push, or Estonia against constant subversion, the little green men syndrome. I mean, the situation in Moldova is exactly like the situation in the Donbass before 2022. The situation in Estonia is not quite like the Donbass, but could be made to be like it, and in Latvia as well. And Putin's motives, I think, will be to demonstrate that NATO is a paper tiger, that NATO can't do anything. And so some of us, some groups like the northern countries, will find themselves trying to confront Russian action in ways that we'll find difficult. So that's what I mean by going to war with Russia. In terms of soft power, I don't. The Russians don't have a lot of soft power, and we do, but we don't mobilize it terribly well. And in a way, soft power is difficult to mobilize because if you try and mobilize it, it looks like propaganda. Soft power is the power of magnetism, the power of being strong because of what you are, not what you try and push towards other countries. But I mean, the Russians are very good at subversion. And they have increased. Now, again, I speak, to military chiefs and security chiefs often enough, and I believe what they say. They say that Russia's subversive activities have gone up 2- and 3-fold in the last 2 or 3 years. Literally, they've doubled and trebled the things that they are doing and trying to recruit. In the latest understanding, they're trying to recruit bunches of young people just to commit acts of sabotage, mindless acts of sabotage for very small amounts of money or for the sheer devilment of it. And if they can inspire that sense of dislocation, that's just one thing that they try to do. So they're doing that all the time. Our governments keep saying we're onto this. We know it's happening, but we're not doing very much to prevent it. At the government level, there's lots of initiatives, but they're not filtering down to wider society. Partly because I think our government doesn't want to frighten people. We've got a government that's very nervous at the moment of public reaction. It's frightened of its own backbenchers. There's a sense of real nervousness in Whitehall about addressing the things that they know is happening, but they just don't know quite what to, how deeply into society to try and push it.
That's great, thank you. We're aware of the time, and I'd like to end with a final question that has actually been posted by Pete, who is sitting next to me, and has enabled this whole thing to happen through Zoom.
Thanks,
So,
Pete.
Pete, would you like to ask your own question?
Michael, I'd be interested in your views on what you think the impact of robots and robots will be in war and economically.
Yeah, I mean, in warfare, it's known as fifth generation and sixth generation warfare, which is the revolution in robotics. So we all think about drones. We see them in Ukraine, but actually, they're in every field. So they're on the ground, at sea, in the air. Some of them are tiny, some of them are big. We're on the verge of that sixth generation revolution, which builds on the fifth generation, and it's going to change the nature of warfare. We can see it changing warfare in Ukraine quite a lot. I mean, we're onto a third type of warfare in Ukraine now. I mean, 2022 it was one type. It changed again in 2024. It's changed again since early 25. And so we're onto a kind of a third style of warfare now, which is very different to what was happening in 2022. So it has a big effect on warfare, which the Western countries are trying to absorb and work through. And there are some, from a purely military technical perspective, there are lots of advantages in that, and some good routes towards better forces with fewer people and so on. You've got to be careful how you say it, but I mean, that's certainly true. Economically, again, this goes back to what I said about globalization. Robotics linked with AI and real computing power, really strong computing power, that creates enormous efficiencies, but structural unemployment. And that's a balance that we've got to think through. We humanity has got to get used to. You can carry on throwing people at it. I mean, it's what Trump's policies in the States are, to get more jobs for American workers to go and do what they were doing 20 and 30 years ago. And what he may do is he'll get some growth in industries that will hit a plateau very quickly and be undermined by competition from robots. And that's why, you know, Trump's protectionism is directed in the wrong sort of way. That's not my view. That's the view of most American economists, but it's what he's doing. Ultimately, it will create even more dislocation, and we've got to be aware of that in order to understand where the human element comes in, because there's, you know, no revolution in world politics, no technical revolution has ever really created no jobs. I mean, all of them create disruption, but always people find ways of living their lives and earning money and, you know, creating useful, productive lives by working around the technologies. And I expect that will be the case this time, but we don't quite know how that's going to work out. But I believe it will work out, but not by the old-fashioned methods.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. What a lot for us to think about and to continue to debate. We're very grateful for that. And so this is recorded. So people who are on this call, please watch it again, but also please share the debates. We want the message to get out as far as we possibly can. And I would really like to echo what you've said about how important groups like this are, because I think that the liberal democracies have been caught napping. Yeah. And I think that we have to work really hard in our communities and in every platform that we can to actually enshrine really what we believe to be important and valuable in the way that our societies are structured and lived. So yes, thank you so much. I'd just like to remind everybody that the 14th of February is our next Hexham Debate, and it's on climate. And also in a couple of months' time, Tyndale Transformed, who are in partnership with the Hexham Debates, will be running 3 face-to-face public meetings on issues that have been raised through the debates. This is in Hexham with a bit more of a local focus, so we'll let you know about that. So thank you for joining us, everybody, and thank you again to Michael, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.